The man who called himself Gerald Harmon slapped the document onto Ada Talbot's kitchen table with the confidence of someone who had never once been caught in a lie. "It's all there," he said, smoothing his lapel with a ringed hand, his smile stretched wide beneath a thin, oiled mustache. "Signed, witnessed, and filed with the county recorder's office in Abilene. Your father sold me the eastern 40 acres of Talbot land 3 weeks before his passing. God rest his soul." Ada did not move. She stood at the far end of that pine table with her arms crossed over her chest, her dark eyes fixed on the document, and something cold and precise moved through her like the edge of a blade finding its target. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Outside, the October wind pressed against the clapboard walls of the ranch house. Behind her, she could hear Wesley Langston's boots shift on the floorboards, the quiet creak of a man trying to hold himself still when every instinct told him to act. "Mr. Harmon," Ada said, her voice carrying that particular quietness that those who knew her understood as the most dangerous register she possessed. "Would you like to explain to me why my father's signature on this document is written with his right hand?" Harmon's smile did not fall immediately. It hung there a half-second too long before his eyes flickered down to the paper. "I beg your pardon. My father," Ada said, walking slowly to the table, "broke 3 fingers on his right hand in the summer of 1878 in a roping accident. From that autumn forward, every letter, every contract, every signature James Talbot ever produced was written with his left hand. I have 22 years of his handwriting. I have his letters, his ledgers, his Bible inscriptions, his land deeds." She stopped directly across from Harmon. "And not one single letter in this signature matches what his left hand produced, but it matches his old right-hand script almost perfectly, which means whoever forged this had access to documents from before 1878, but did not know about the accident, or did not think anyone still alive would." The room went completely still. Wesley Langston, who had been leaning against the far wall in the capacity of a witness, because Ada had asked him to be present when the man arrived, pushed himself upright. He was watching Ada with an expression she would not see until much later, when she finally looked at him, an expression of absolute and total astonishment. Harmon's face underwent a transformation that was almost interesting to watch. The salesman's warmth drained out of it in layers, like color leaving a cloth left too long in the sun, and what remained beneath was something harder and considerably less pleasant. "You can't prove that," he said. "I already have," Ada said. "I sent copies of this document to the county recorder in Abilene yesterday, along with 3 authenticated samples of my father's left hand writing from the years 1879 through 1882, and a written statement from Dr. Emil Cross, who set my father's fingers, and has a record of the injury dated August the 14th, 1878. The marshal in Caldwell County has been notified as of this morning." That was when Harmon's hand moved toward his coat, and that was when Wesley Langston crossed the room in 3 strides. But it was Ada who already had the small brass-framed Remington Derringer in her hand, leveled steadily at the center of Gerald Harmon's chest, having drawn it from the pocket of her work apron with a calm that suggested she had done this kind of thing before. "I would not," she said simply. Harmon froze. Wesley stopped beside him, close enough to remove the man's coat pistol without ceremony, and he did precisely that, his jaw set and his eyes moving from Harmon to Ada with a complicated emotion he could not yet name. "Sit down, Mr. Harmon," Ada said. "The marshal will be here inside the hour. You may wait comfortably or uncomfortably. The choice is yours." This was the morning that began everything. To understand how Ada Talbot had become a woman who could identify a forged signature by the mechanical memory of her dead father's hand, you needed to go back 7 years, to the spring of 1876, when she was 19 years old, and her father James had decided, against the advice of nearly everyone he knew, to let her learn the bookkeeping. James Talbot had built the Painted Rock Ranch on 3,700 acres of Kansas grassland south of Wichita, starting from nothing but a land grant, a mule, and a stubbornness that his neighbors had alternately admired and resented. He had lost his wife, Ada's mother Charlotte, to a fever when Ada was 11, and after that it had been just the two of them on the land, father and daughter, building something from the morning dark to the evening dark every day without rest. Ada had been, from earliest memory, her father's sharpest tool. She absorbed numbers the way dry ground took in rain. She could look at a column of figures and find the error in it the way some people could look at a landscape and immediately identify what was wrong. James Talbot had never quite known what to do with a daughter like that in the world he lived in, but he had been, in the end, a practical man, and practicality won out over convention. By the time Ada was 21, she was running the books for Painted Rock with a precision that had saved the ranch twice from poor speculation, and once from a contractor who had been systematically overcharging for lumber. By 23, she could identify any supplier's invoice as legitimate or fraudulent within 2 minutes of examination. By 25, she had taught herself graphology from a correspondence course published out of Philadelphia, and she had a working knowledge of document authentication that surpassed anything available west of Kansas City. She was 26 in the autumn of 1883 when her father died. He had gone quietly in his sleep in the room where he had slept for 15 years, after a summer of declining health that neither of them had spoken about directly because speaking about it would have made it approach faster. The doctor said it was his heart. Ada thought it was simpler than that. She thought he had finished the work he had come to do and he had laid down the tools. He left her everything: the land, the cattle, the debts, the contracts, and a ranch that still needed someone at its helm. She buried him in the cedar grove at the northeast corner of the property, next to her mother, and she grieved in the way that capable people who have no time to stop often grieve, which is to say that she folded it inside her and kept it working somewhere deep while her hands remained busy. She had exactly 43 days of solitary management before Gerald Harmon rode up her drive. She had 35 days of knowing Wesley Langston before that morning in the kitchen. Wesley had arrived at Painted Rock in a way that was unremarkable on its surface, and considerably less so on examination. He had ridden through in the last week of September, following a cattle drive from Texas that had ended in Wichita, looking for work for the winter rather than drifting south again the way most trail hands did. He had stopped at Painted Rock because the fence on the south boundary had a section down, and he had seen it from the road, and decided without much conscious deliberation that fixing a stranger's fence was worth doing. Ada had found him at it when she rode the south boundary that afternoon on her bay mare, and she had sat in the saddle and watched him work for a long moment before he noticed her. He was a large man. Not in the way of someone who carried extra weight, but in the way of someone who had spent years at physical labor, and had become, through that labor, something close to what a sculptor would have produced if given unlimited time and quality stone. He was 31 years old, with dark hair and a face that had been weathered to an honest roughness by years of sun and wind, the kind of face that was deeply uncomfortable to look at directly for too long because it was too easy to keep looking. When he noticed Ada sitting on her horse watching him, he straightened up without embarrassment and touched the brim of his hat. "Fence was down," he said, as if that explained everything, which in his worldview it did. "I can see that," Ada said, "and I can see you're fixing it. Do you work for a reason or as a philosophical exercise?" He looked at her steadily. "Usually for a reason." "Good," she said. "I need a foreman. The last one left when my father died because he said he wasn't comfortable taking orders from a woman. If that describes you, tell me now and save us both the inconvenience." Wesley Langston looked at her for a long moment in the manner of someone assessing something carefully. "Does the work need doing?" he asked. "More than I can manage alone." "Then I don't see that it matters much who's giving the orders," he said, and went back to the fence. She hired him that afternoon. She paid him $40 a month and found out within his first week that she had gotten considerably more than she had paid for. Wesley Langston was the kind of ranch hand who understood cattle the way some men understand machinery, intuitively and completely, with a knowledge that came from long practice and genuine attention. He could read weather in the behavior of the herd an hour before it arrived. He could identify a sick animal from 100 yards before the symptoms were visible. He was also, Ada discovered with some surprise, completely comfortable with silence, which was rare in men who worked the land and rarer still in men who were physically impressive enough to feel entitled to fill all available space with themselves. He did not crowd her. He did not second-guess her decisions in front of the hands. When he disagreed with her, he told her privately, directly, and once, and after she had heard his reasoning and given her response, he accepted it and moved on. It was the most functional working relationship Ada had experienced with anyone since her father, and she found it quietly unsettling in the way that only things that are genuinely good for you can be. She had not planned to pay attention to him in any way beyond the professional. She was too busy, for one thing, and she had, over the years, developed a certain protective skepticism about men who were physically attractive, having found that the world generally cut them considerably more slack than they deserved, and that they often knew it. But Wesley Langston did not behave as though the world owed him anything. He worked the same hours as everyone else. He ate the same food. He fixed fences on days when it was not technically his job, and he listened when she spoke, which sounds like a small thing and is not. The first real crack in Ada's professional reserve came approximately 2 weeks after he arrived, on a night when the temperature dropped unexpectedly, and they lost power on the water pump in the east barn. And Ada had spent 3 hours in the cold with a lantern and a set of tools she had learned to use by necessity, trying to diagnose the mechanical failure. Wesley had come out to see what was happening and had stood beside her with another lantern, handing her tools when she asked for them and holding the light where she needed it. And at one point she had turned to ask him for a wrench and found him watching her with an expression that was very difficult to categorize, but was not the usual expression men wore when a woman was doing something they considered unexpected. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and handed her the wrench. "Where did you learn to work a pump mechanism?" "From a manual and from doing it wrong several times," she said. "The same place I learned most things." He said nothing more, but she was aware of him differently after that, in the way that you become aware of a room's dimensions after someone has moved the furniture. The second crack came a week later, when a dispute arose between two of the ranch hands about a property boundary along the creek, and Ada resolved it by producing the original survey map from 1871 and demonstrating with reference to 3 physical landmarks that were still present exactly where the boundary sat. It was not a complicated analysis, but it required both the document knowledge and the spatial memory to connect the old survey to the current landscape, and when it was over and the hands had dispersed, Wesley had stood beside her looking at the survey map for a moment. "You remember every document you've ever read?" he asked. "Most of them," she said. "The ones that mattered." "That's a remarkable thing," he said, in the tone of someone stating a simple fact. "My father used to say it was useful and occasionally frightening," she said. Wesley smiled at that, which was the first time she had seen him do it fully and without restraint, and it changed his face in a way she chose not to think about. Then Gerald Harmon arrived, and everything else became secondary. She had seen the document for the first time 2 days before Harmon's visit, delivered by a lawyer from Wichita named Pendleton, who had the uncomfortable manner of someone who knows they are carrying bad news but has been paid to deliver it professionally. He had explained in the careful language of legal practice that a Mr. Gerald Harmon had presented a deed of sale at the county recorder's office, claiming to have purchased 40 acres of the eastern Talbot land from James Talbot in September of that year, before James's death, and that the document appeared to have been filed with all the appropriate markings. Ada had taken the copy of the document from Pendleton with a steadiness that she maintained through an act of pure will, because what she felt inside was something close to cold fury. She had looked at it that night by lamplight for approximately 30 seconds before she knew. She had known her father's handwriting in all its phases the way she knew her own. She had read his letters from before she was born, letters to her mother that he had kept in a cedar box under the bed. She knew his schoolboy script from the 1840s, his middle period writing from the 1860s, and the distinct leftward tilt of his post-injury left hand from 1878 forward. The signature on Harmon's document was a skilled forgery. It was skilled enough to fool anyone who had only ever seen James Talbot's right-hand writing. It was not skilled enough to fool his daughter. She had spent the next day and a half being very methodical and very calm. She had written to Dr. Cross in Wichita, who responded by telegraph. She had prepared her documentation package for the county recorder. She had sent the notification to the marshal's office. And she had asked Wesley to be present when Harmon came, not because she needed protection, but because she needed a witness of unimpeachable character. And in the 5 weeks she had known him, she had formed the opinion that Wesley Langston was exactly that. She had not told him the details. She had only told him that a man was coming who had made a fraudulent claim on the property, and that she intended to demonstrate the fraud and wanted him there. He had agreed without asking questions, which was one of the things she valued most about him. After Harmon was seated at the kitchen table, after his weapon had been removed, and his bluster had collapsed into a sullen and calculating silence, Wesley stood by the window, and Ada made coffee, and they waited for Marshal Cord Beaumont to arrive from Caldwell. It was in those 40 minutes of waiting that something shifted between them in a way that neither of them chose to examine directly. At one point Wesley said, quietly, so the prisoner could not hear clearly, "The thing about the right hand. How did you know he wouldn't know about the injury?" "I didn't know for certain," Ada said, equally quiet, "but a man who put this much effort into a forgery would have done research. He found documents from before 1878 to copy the signature from, which means his sources were old. He would not have had access to anyone who knew my father personally in his later years. The injury was not widely discussed. My father was a private man. So you were gambling that the forger had old information." "I was reasoning from evidence," she said, which was different, and he understood the distinction. He looked at her then with that same expression she had seen in the barn over the pump, except deeper now and less guarded. And Ada felt something come loose in her chest that she had been holding fixed for a very long time. Marshal Beaumont arrived at 10:30 with 2 deputies, examined the situation with the efficiency of a man who had been managing frontier law since before Kansas was a state, took Gerald Harmon into custody on the charges of fraud and forgery, and was gone again by 11:15. He told Ada she had done good work. He said it the way men of his generation said things to women who had done something impressive, with a note of surprise underneath the approval, and she accepted it with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime accepting imperfect compliments. When the marshal's wagon rolled away down the drive, Ada and Wesley stood on the porch steps in the October wind, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You already had everything ready before he walked through the door," Wesley said. "Yes. You let him think he still had a chance." "It was important that he come," she said. "If I had sent everything directly to the marshal without meeting him, he might have fled, and if he fled there would still have been a legal question about the document. I needed him present so that the denial could be made face to face and recorded." Wesley shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something more like wonder. "Ada," he said, and stopped. She looked at him directly. "What?" He seemed to consider, and then to abandon several different things he might have said. What he finally said was, "I've ridden with a lot of people, worked for a lot of people. I've never seen anyone manage something like that the way you just did." It was not a flowery compliment. It was not the kind of thing men usually said to women in 1883 in rural Kansas. It was a straight assessment from someone who did not say things he did not mean, and it landed differently than any praise she had received in her life. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're not just running this ranch," he said. You're protecting it. That's a different thing. My father built it, she said. No one is going to take pieces of it apart with a forged signature. He nodded. And then he said, very quietly, he'd be proud of you. She turned away from him then because she was not entirely certain what her face was doing, and she went back inside to make a second pot of coffee and to breathe. The aftermath of the Harmon affair took several weeks to fully resolve. Ada appeared twice before the county recorder's office in Wichita to testify on the handwriting analysis, bringing her documentation and her evidence, and speaking with a precision that left the court officials visibly unsettled at first and visibly persuaded by the end. Gerald Harmon was indicted on 5 counts of fraud across 3 counties because it emerged that Talbot land had not been his first attempt, and he was ultimately sentenced to 6 years in the territorial prison at Lansing. The attempted land theft became known in the surrounding community, as things in small communities do, and Ada found herself looked at differently on both sides. Some people, mostly older men and a few of the neighboring ranchers' wives, regarded her with a new kind of respect that had a quality of relief in it, as though she had demonstrated something on behalf of all people who had feared they could not defend themselves. A smaller number of people, also mostly men of a certain character, regarded her with a new kind of wariness that she recognized and did not particularly mind. Wesley said nothing publicly about what he had witnessed, but his manner toward her in the weeks that followed was different in ways that were subtle enough to ignore if she had wanted to and impossible to miss if she was paying attention. He was more careful with her. Not in the way of someone treating a fragile thing, but in the way of someone who has learned the value of something and handles it accordingly. He began, very gradually, to tell her things about himself, not all at once, not in any deliberate or confessional way, but in the manner of someone who has been private for a long time and is slowly, cautiously, allowing a door to open. She learned about his childhood in Missouri, about a father who had worked a tannery and a mother who had wanted all her children to learn to read and had succeeded with most of them. She learned that he had been working cattle since he was 17, that he had come west on a cattle drive in 1871 and simply never gone back, that he had spent 3 years in Colorado before coming south again on a series of drives through Texas. She learned, one evening in early November when they were riding the fence line together and the light was going gold and amber across the grass, that he had not stayed in any one place long because he had never found a place he wanted to stay. He said it without self-pity and without any particular implication, looking straight ahead at the fence line. "What would make you want to stay somewhere?" Ada asked. She was asking practically, with genuine curiosity, in the way she asked most things. He was quiet for a moment. "Something worth staying for," he said, and did not look at her. She thought about that later, in the lamplit silence of her father's study where she kept the books, working through the November figures. She thought about it in the way she thought about things that required careful examination, which was to say that she turned it over, looked at its angles, considered what it meant and what it did not necessarily mean, and then put it aside to look at again. She was not naive. She had not spent 26 years being the sharpest person in most rooms by failing to understand what was happening around her. She understood that something was developing between herself and Wesley Langston. She understood that it was mutual in a way that made her more cautious, not less, because she had learned early that the things that mattered were the things worth being careful with. She did not know that he was lying awake in the bunkhouse having his own version of the same consideration, which would have required her to know things about him that he had not yet said. November was a difficult month in terms of weather, which was its own kind of useful. It gave them both plenty to do. There were cattle to move to the winter pastures, a water trough on the north end that froze unexpectedly and needed to be opened twice daily, a section of barn roof that needed patching before the first serious snow, and an ongoing dispute with a neighboring rancher named Sam Eccles about a shared water source along the eastern boundary. The Eccles dispute was not violent and was not the kind of dramatic confrontation that made stories. It was the ordinary grinding friction of two people who had different interests in the same resource. And Ada handled it the same way she handled everything, which was to document it thoroughly, know her rights precisely, and negotiate from that position. Wesley helped her prepare for the meeting with Eccles by riding the eastern boundary with her on a Sunday afternoon, identifying the exact points she would need to reference, and suggesting, without overstepping, that she might mention to Eccles the precedent from the 1878 Dodge City water rights case that had established the upstream usage principle. She looked at him with some surprise. "You know about the 1878 water rights case," she said. "A man I drove cattle with in '79 had been involved in it," he said. "He talked about it considerably. Did you know that precedent would apply here?" "I thought it might," he said. "I wasn't sure enough to say anything until I'd walked the boundary and checked the grade." She looked at him for a long moment. "You let me present to Eccles," she said slowly, working through it. "But you had already thought through the legal angle." "You would have gotten there," he said simply. "You always do." "That's not the point," she said. "Why didn't you say anything before?" He considered this. "Because it's your ranch and your negotiation," he said. "And because I thought you'd like to know where I got it from before you used it." It was exactly the right answer. She knew it was the right answer because it was the answer that respected both her intelligence and her authority simultaneously, which was not something she had experienced often. And she felt something shift in herself again, that same loosening, the same warmth that moved through her chest like coffee on a cold morning, except stronger and more difficult to name. The meeting with Eccles went well. Ada presented the upstream usage precedent along with her own documentation of the water levels and dates, and Eccles, who was difficult but not stupid, recognized when he was outmatched and negotiated to a fair resolution. He also looked at Ada with the same quality of surprised respect that had been appearing in people's faces since the Harmon affair, and she handled that with the same grace as always. On the ride home in the early December dark, with the first suggestion of snow in the air and the horses breathing steam, Ada said to Wesley, "The 1878 case, you should have just told me." "I know," he said. "You don't need to manage what I know or don't know," she said. "I understand that," he said. "I'm saying it because I want you to understand I can use information without it diminishing what I do with it," she said. "You giving me a tool doesn't make the work less mine." He looked at her in the dark. "I know that," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to arrive at it yourself first. Habit, I suppose. I'll drop it." "Do," she said, but not harshly. And then, after a pause, "Thank you for knowing it." He nodded once, and in the dark between them, something that had been building very slowly for 2 months took another step. It was the second week of December when things became less managed. They had been working late in the barn on a piece of equipment, a hay press that had developed a mechanical fault in the tension arm, and Ada had been diagnosing the problem while Wesley held the lamp. They were both cold. The lamp threw uneven shadows and the work was fiddly, and she had been at it for an hour when her hand slipped on the wrench, and she cut the heel of her palm on the edge of the press mechanism. It was not a serious cut. It bled more than it hurt, the way cuts on the palm do, and she made a short, sharp sound and pressed her hand to her coat. Wesley was beside her before she had time to register that he had moved. He took her hand in both of his with a gentleness that was startling given the size of them, turned it to see the cut in the lamplight, and then reached for the clean cloth in his coat pocket and pressed it firmly to the wound with the assured competence of someone who had dealt with field injuries before. They were standing very close together. The barn was cold and smelled of hay and oil, and the particular animal warmth that lingered in spaces where horses stood. The lamp made the light amber and close. "It's not deep," he said. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady. The rest of her was not entirely. He was still holding her hand. He was looking at the cut, making sure the bleeding was slowing, which it was. And then he looked up, and the distance between them was very small, and neither of them moved. "Ada," he said. "Don't," she said, not because she did not want whatever he was about to say, but because she was not ready to hear it yet. She needed more time than she had. He closed his mouth, but he did not step back. He finished wrapping the cloth around her palm and held it there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, his hands around hers, and she felt the warmth of them all the way up her arm. "All right," he said quietly, and stepped back and picked up the lamp. She repaired the hay press in another 20 minutes, and they walked back to the house through the cold dark and said good night at the porch, and she went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the lamp burning low, thinking about the warmth of someone's hands and what it meant to want something very much and not yet know whether you were ready to have it. Christmas came to Painted Rock with a quiet that was different from the silence of loneliness. Ada had spent Christmases alone before, in the sense of being without company, but there had always been her father in the house, his solid presence filling the rooms even when neither of them were talking. This was the first Christmas in the house as its sole occupant, and she felt the shape of that absence in the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. She had thought, in the days before, about simply carrying on, working the holiday through, which was possible and practical and would have kept her hands occupied. But she had grown up in a household that took celebration seriously because her father had understood that there were things in life which required marking, and she found she could not simply let the day pass unlabeled. She invited the ranch hands for Christmas dinner, which was the practical thing. She cooked a considerable amount of food, which was satisfying work, and she set the long table in the main room, and she brought out the good linens that had been her mother's. And she told Wesley, when she found him that morning repairing a bridle in the barn, that dinner was at 5 o'clock, and she expected him to come inside and sit at the table like a human being and not eat standing up in the cold. He looked up from the bridle. His expression had that quality it got sometimes, careful and warm at once, like a man who was holding something and did not want to drop it. "I'll be there," he said. Dinner was boisterous in the way that a table of hard-working men in warm surroundings tends to be boisterous, and Ada found herself genuinely glad of the noise. She had two other permanent hands, a man named Billy Cartwright who was 22 and enthusiastic about everything, and an older hand named Pete Haskell who had worked for her father for 6 years and treated Ada with a respectful directness that she appreciated. There were two seasonal hands who wintered on for the extra work, and they filled the table with the kind of energy that made the house feel inhabited rather than occupied. Wesley sat at the end nearest the kitchen and talked less than the others but listened well, which Ada had come to understand was simply how he was in groups. He caught her eye once across the table, when Billy was in the middle of an elaborate story about a horse he had once ridden in a Texas county fair, and something passed between them that was not quite a smile and not quite a conversation, but occupied the space between those things. After the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and Ada was washing the dishes, Wesley came back to the kitchen. He had not been explicitly invited to do this. He came in through the back door and took up a position beside the stove without comment and helped her dry the dishes with a methodical thoroughness, and they worked in the comfortable silence that had become their particular language over the past 2 months. When the dishes were done, he said, "I want to give you something." She turned to look at him. He produced from his coat pocket a small package wrapped in brown paper, and she took it with a surprise that she could not quite neutralize. She opened it carefully. Inside was a journal, a proper one with a dark green leather cover and good paper, and on the inside of the front cover in Wesley's straight handwriting were the words, "For Ada Talbot, who keeps better records than anyone I have ever known. December 25, 1883. She looked at it for a moment. "I know you keep ledgers," he said. "I thought you might want something that wasn't a ledger." She looked up at him, and the careful professional distance she had maintained between them for 2 months was present in her still, but it was thinner now, and she could feel the places where it had worn through. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. He was watching her with that expression that she had cataloged now and could identify in the dark, the expression of someone who cares about you and is trying very hard not to make it a problem. She did not make a decision in that moment so much as she allowed something that had already been decided to become visible. She crossed the 3 feet of kitchen between them and kissed him, which was a simple and precise action, and terrified her completely, and felt more correct than anything she had done in years. He was completely still for exactly 1 second, as if his whole body had to take a moment to verify the information it was receiving. And then he kissed her back in the way that tall, quiet men often do things, with a thoroughness and a focus that suggested his full attention had arrived at once. His hands came up and rested at her waist with that same gentleness she had noticed in the barn, careful and certain together, and she felt the warmth of him as a solid physical fact in a cold house in December. And somewhere in her chest, the thing she had been holding fixed for 2 months released completely. When she stepped back, they looked at each other for a moment. "Ada," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm aware of what I just did." He almost smiled. "I wasn't going to object." "Good," she said. "Then don't." He did not. January brought the serious cold, the kind of winter that Kansas produced when it was not in the mood to be pleasant, and the work of the ranch intensified accordingly. Cattle needed constant watching. Water sources needed daily checking. The north wind came across the grassland with nothing to stop it and made everything require twice the effort. Ada and Wesley worked side by side through it in the manner of people who had been doing this together for years, which in some ways they had been, even if the calendar said only 4 months. They had the rhythm of each other now, the understanding of how the other thought and moved and made decisions, and it made the work more efficient and made the hours less grinding and made the cold less absolute. The shift between them since Christmas was not dramatic or sudden. It was more like a door that had been carefully, slowly opened and was now simply open, and both of them had walked through it without needing to announce the crossing. He came to the house most evenings after the work was done, and they sat by the fire and she read or worked on the books while he mended tack or cleaned equipment. And they talked in the easy way of people who have run out of the need to impress each other and arrived at the simpler and better thing. He told her, one evening in mid-January, about a woman he had been engaged to in Colorado in 1876, a woman named Frances who had eventually married a mining engineer and moved to Denver. He told it without bitterness and without self-pity as a fact of his history, and Ada received it in the same way. "Did you love her?" she asked. "I thought I did," he said. "Looking back, I think I was in love with the idea of staying somewhere. She was a good woman, we just wanted different things." "What did you want?" He looked at the fire for a moment. "Something real," he said. "Something that didn't need me to be something I wasn't." Ada thought about that. "What were you trying to be for her?" she asked. "Settled," he said. "Domestic, the kind of man who wanted a parlor and a city address." He shook his head. "Not my nature." "No," Ada agreed. "It's not." He looked at her. "Is that a criticism?" "No," she said. "I don't have much use for parlors either." That quiet understanding between them deepened as February came in, cold and clear and wide. They rode together most afternoons when the work allowed it, and the riding was its own kind of conversation, the kind that happened in the space between words, in the way 2 people on horseback look at the same landscape and see the same things in it. Ada had stopped being cautious with herself about what she felt. She had made that decision somewhere in January and stuck with it with the same stubbornness she applied to everything. She was not cautious by nature. She was thorough, which was different. Caution implies fear of proceeding. Thoroughness implies a desire to understand before proceeding. She had been thorough about Wesley Langston, and her findings were not complicated. He was a good man. He was honest in the deepest structural sense, the way some people are honest not as a practice but as a constitution. He was competent and humble about his competence in a combination that was rare and valuable. He treated her as an equal in a time when that was not easy or expected. He had watched her expose a forger in her own kitchen and been awed rather than threatened, which told her something fundamental about his character that all the months of daily observation had only confirmed. And she loved him. She had arrived at that word in the way she arrived at conclusions, through careful examination of the evidence, and she was not surprised by it and she was not frightened of it. She did not say it yet because she was thorough, not impulsive. It was Wesley who said it first. It was the first week of March, and the weather had broken in the way that Kansas weather breaks, with a swiftness that felt almost aggressive after months of siege. The grass was not yet green, but the air had a different quality, the sharp bite of winter softening at its edges, and they had ridden out to check the northeast pasture, and were sitting their horses on the rise that overlooked the cedar grove where Ada's parents were buried. Ada went quiet when they reached this spot. She always did. She was not sad exactly, or not only sad, but she was aware of her parents here in a way that was very immediate and very specific. Wesley said nothing. He had learned her well enough to know when silence was the right offering. After a while she said, "My father would have liked you. Would he? He valued practical men. Men who worked without needing to explain themselves." She paused. "He also valued people who were honest about what they didn't know. He said that was rarer than competence." "He sounds like a good man to know," Wesley said. "He was the best man I've ever known," she said, "until recently." He looked at her then, and the look had that same quality she had first catalogued over the water pump 5 months ago, but there was nothing restrained in it now. "Ada," he said, "I love you." He said it plainly, in the way he said most things, without decoration. But the plainness of it was its own kind of strength. She held it for a moment in the manner of someone who wants to make sure they have received a thing correctly before responding. "I know," she said, which was not a deflection but a truth. "And then, I love you too." The horses shifted slightly. The wind moved through the cedar grove below them with that particular sound that cedars make, something between a whisper and a sigh. "Good," Wesley said. And he reached over and took her hand, and they sat there for a while longer in the March light above the graves, and it was the most peaceful Ada had felt in longer than she could accurately remember. Spring came to Painted Rock with its own agenda. There was calving season, which was always intense and exhausting and required round-the-clock attention for its peak weeks, and Ada was in the middle of it every day alongside the hands, checking on the new arrivals, making decisions about which animals needed assistance and which were better managed without interference, keeping records of every birth and every complication with her characteristic precision. Wesley was extraordinary during calving. He had a particular knowledge and calm around the process that Ada admired professionally and also simply loved to watch. The way he moved among the cattle, with a steadiness that communicated itself to the animals in a way that reduced their distress. He was patient with the difficult cases in a way that exhausted men in cold barns at 3 in the morning rarely managed to be. There was one difficult night in April, a first-time heifer in significant distress, and Ada and Wesley had both been up through it. And when it was finally over and the calf was on its feet and the heifer was settled, they had sat down on the hay bales outside the stall, and Ada had leaned her head against Wesley's shoulder and fallen briefly asleep while he kept watch, and he had let her sleep for 20 minutes before the next check was needed. She woke to his hand on her shoulder, careful and steady. 20 minutes, he said. You needed it. She sat up and shook the sleep from her eyes and went back to work. But something about those 20 minutes stayed with her, the ease of them, the fact of being looked after by someone who understood that the looking after was not a rescue but a rest, a fellow worker standing the next watch while you caught your breath. She started to think, for the first time, about what the future might look like, not in abstract terms but in specific ones. She had never been particularly drawn to marriage as an institution, having watched it flatten many of the women she knew into smaller versions of themselves. But what she was beginning to understand was that what happened between her and Wesley bore very little resemblance to what she had observed in those marriages. There was no flattening here. She had not become smaller. If anything, she had become more fully herself because she was known, and being known by someone who valued what they knew allowed you to be that thing more completely. She was thinking about this on a Saturday morning in May when Wesley appeared at the kitchen door with a purposeful quality about him that she recognized as the manner of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it before they can think better of it. "Come out to the porch," he said. She came out to the porch. It was a beautiful morning, the first truly warm morning of the year, with the prairie grass beginning to show its deep early summer green, and the sky above painted rock an unblemished blue that went all the way to the far edge of the world. Wesley was standing at the porch rail, not leaning on it the way he usually stood, but standing straight, with his hat in his hands, which she had learned was his tell when he was doing something that mattered to him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want to stay at Painted Rock, not as the foreman," he looked at her directly, "as your husband if you'll have me." There was no ring. He had not produced a ring, and she understood later that he had thought about it and decided that producing a ring would feel like a transaction, and he did not want this to be a transaction. He was offering himself without props, in the direct and unadorned way he did everything. Ada looked at him for a moment. The June wind moved through the grass below the porch. The ranch spread away in all directions around them, her father's work and now hers, 3,700 acres of Kansas grassland that she had defended and managed and intended to keep for as long as she drew breath. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He smiled at that, the full smile that she would never entirely get used to no matter how many years she had to look at it, and he came to her and held her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she put her hands on his chest and felt his heart beating steadily under her palms. "Obviously," he repeated, with the warmth of someone who is too happy to be dignified about it. "I've been in love with you since at least February," she said. "Possibly longer." "I've been in love with you since the barn," he said. "The water pump. That was October." "Yes," he said. She laughed, which was not something she did frequently, and was therefore something he had been, in all the months of their acquaintance, quietly working toward. They were married in June of 1884, on a clear Saturday morning, in the small Methodist church in Caldwell that Ada had attended occasionally and Wesley had attended once, with the minister who had known James Talbot and was visibly moved by the occasion. Billy Cartwright played the fiddle. Pete Haskell stood as Wesley's witness, having accepted the request with the gruff warmth of an old cowhand who approves of things but will not say so directly. Ada wore her mother's blue dress, which she had altered to fit, and the cedar grove at the northeast corner of the property that held her parents' graves was in full leaf that day in a way that felt deliberately good. The wedding was not large. Ada had not wanted large. She wanted real, which was what she got. Marshall Cord Beaumont rode out to offer congratulations, which was good of him and reflected the regard in which the Talbot name was held in Caldwell County following the Harmon affair. Several of the neighboring ranchers came, including Sam Eccles, who brought his wife and shook Wesley's hand with the particular respect of a man, acknowledging that his adversary had married well. They danced on the porch that evening after dinner, Ada and Wesley, in the late light of a June Saturday, to Billy's fiddle playing something slow and easy, and the hands sat on the steps and the fence rails, and in the warmth of the early summer dark, it was the kind of evening that does not require anything additional to be complete in itself. The first year of their marriage was also the first year of their genuine partnership, which was a different thing from the working relationship that had preceded it. Wesley took on the formal management of the cattle operations, while Ada maintained the financial management and document work, and the combination proved considerably more effective than either of them had been independently, not because they needed each other to function, but because they amplified each other, the way two instruments playing together can produce a sound neither can produce alone. Ada taught Wesley what she knew about document analysis and contract law in the specific applied way of someone explaining a tool to someone who will use it alongside them. He proved a quick and attentive student, particularly in the areas of contract language, where his instinct for honesty made him a reliable spotter of the places where legal language was designed to mislead. She expanded the graphology work she had begun after the Harmon affair, developing a reputation in the region as someone who could evaluate disputed documents, and this began to generate a modest but steady income from legal and commercial clients who needed that expertise. Wesley did not blink at any of it. He was, if anything, pleased by it in the way that a person is pleased when someone they love does something well, which is to say that her success was simply something he was glad about without any complicated feelings about its source. The thing about Gerald Harmon had its final resolution in the spring of 1885, when he was brought to trial in Wichita on the multiple fraud charges. Ada testified. She sat in the witness stand in the county courthouse and presented her handwriting analysis to the court with the same precision she had first deployed in her kitchen 18 months earlier, and the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a conviction on all counts. Wesley was in the gallery. She saw him when she looked up from the witness stand, sitting in the third row with his hat in his hands and his face wearing the expression she had come to think of as his particular form of pride, quiet and solid and entirely without performance. Afterward, on the courthouse steps in the spring sunshine of Wichita, he said, "You know what I thought about while you were in there?" "What?" she said. "That afternoon in October," he said. "When you had him in the kitchen and you were already 3 steps ahead of everything he was going to do." He shook his head. "I had no idea what I was watching. I just knew I was watching something I hadn't seen before." "You were watching someone protect their home," she said. "I was watching the person I was going to spend my life with," he said. "I just didn't know it yet." She took his arm and they walked down the courthouse steps into the spring day, and that particular thread was finished. The summer of 1885 brought with it a development that neither of them had discussed in any explicit way, but that both of them had thought about with a particular quality of hope. In July, Ada told Wesley that she was expecting a child, and she told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in the practical way she said most things important, directly and without preamble. He stood very still for a moment. And then he came to her and held her the way he held things he cared about, carefully and completely, and she felt the particular quality of his stillness that she had learned to read as the form his deepest feeling took. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. "I'm healthy. The doctor expects no complications." "Good," he said, and then into her hair, "Ada." "I know," she said. Their son was born in the first week of February 1886, during a clear cold night that felt, Ada thought afterward, like an apology from the winter for all its recent difficulties. He was large and healthy, and had a full head of dark hair that Wesley's face did complicated things at the sight of. They named him James Langston, for Ada's father, and the name sat well in the house. Billy Cartwright celebrated so enthusiastically that he fell off the porch steps. Pete Haskell held the baby with the gravitas of a man who had not held a baby in 30 years and was taking it very seriously. The ranch carried on around them with its daily requirements, unconcerned with the momentousness of the event, which Ada found appropriate. James was a good baby in the sense of being healthy and possessed of clear preferences and the ability to communicate them, which meant he was not always quiet but was always legible. Ada managed the early months with her characteristic organizational thoroughness and the practical assistance of a woman from Caldwell named Mrs. Dora Finch, who came 3 days a week and was brusque and competent and treated Ada with the respect of one capable person for another. Wesley was, as a father, exactly what Ada had expected he would be. He was present and patient and consistent in the way that he was present and patient and consistent in everything, and he held James with the same steady gentleness he used with everything small and important, and Ada watched him sometimes in the evenings when he did not know she was watching, and she thought that she had been correct in October of 1883 when she had assessed Wesley Langston as someone whose character was worth understanding. She had been correct about a great many things in her life. This was the one she was most glad of. Painted Rock grew in the years that followed in the slow, organic way of healthy things. They added 300 acres in 1887, purchasing a parcel from a neighbor who was retiring to Missouri, and expanded the cattle operation accordingly. Ada's document analysis work continued to develop, and by 1889 she had a formal arrangement with 2 law offices in Wichita and 1 in Caldwell to provide expert review services. It was not the largest income the ranch produced, but it was hers in a specific way, the direct product of the skills she had developed from scratch over 20 years of paying attention, and she valued it accordingly. They hired 2 additional permanent hands in 1888, a young man named Marcus who had come up from Texas on a cattle drive and stayed, and a quiet, experienced hand named Roberto Alvarado, who had managed cattle on the Mexican side of the border for 15 years, and had knowledge of land and water management that proved immediately valuable, and that Wesley treated with the direct respect of one professional for another's expertise. The ranch hands were a small community unto themselves, and Ada managed that community with the same attention she brought to everything else. She was not a soft employer. She was fair, which is a harder and better thing. She paid on time and in full and held people to the standards she had set, and she was not sentimental about those who could not or would not meet them, but she was also not harsh, and the people who stayed at Painted Rock stayed because they wanted to be there, which meant they worked as though they owned the place, which was the arrangement Ada had always considered most practical. Their daughter was born in 1889 in September, when the summer was finally beginning to consider letting go. They named her Charlotte for Ada's mother, and she arrived with such an expression of focused intensity on her face that Wesley said she looked like she was already planning something, which turned out to be an accurate characterization. Charlotte Langston, even as an infant, had opinions. James was 3 years old when his sister arrived and took an immediate proprietary interest in her that he maintained into childhood and beyond. He was going to be tall, like his father, with Ada's dark eyes and the concentrated quality of attention that both his parents possessed, applied at age 3 primarily to horses and mechanisms, which already suggested particular directions. The house at Painted Rock expanded in 1890 to accommodate its population more comfortably. Wesley built the addition himself over the course of the spring and summer with assistance from Marcus and Roberto, and it was solid and well-made in the way that things Wesley built tended to be, and Ada oversaw the interior arrangement with the thoroughness of someone who has thought carefully about how space should function. The winter of 1890 was the kind of winter that tested people and equipment and resolve in equal measure, but Painted Rock came through it with the resources and preparation that 7 years of careful management had produced. And in the spring of 1891, the grass came up thick, and the cattle were in good condition, and the ranch that James Talbot had built from a mule, and a land grant was producing and thriving in a way that would have been deeply satisfying to him. Ada thought about her father often. She kept his Bible on the desk in the study alongside her ledgers, and occasionally she opened it to the pages where he had made notes in the margins in his careful left-hand script, and she read them the way you read letters from someone you love, for the voice more than the content. One evening in that spring of 1891, Wesley found her at the desk with the Bible open and her hand resting on the page, not reading, just resting. He did not say anything. He came and stood behind her and put both hands on her shoulders in the particular way he had of holding things he wanted to keep firm and gentle together, and she put one of her hands over his. He would have loved this, she said quietly. The way it all turned out. Yes, Wesley said, he would. She looked around the study, at the ledgers lined up in their careful order, at the document files she maintained for the legal work, at the cedar box of her father's letters that she had kept on the corner shelf since the day she inherited the house. "Do you know what he told me the last summer?" she said. "When we both knew he was slowing down, though neither of us said so. What did he tell you?" "He said the ranch would be all right as long as I stayed practical." She paused. "He said practicality was the most undervalued form of love." Wesley was quiet for a moment. "He wasn't wrong," he said. She stood up and turned, and he held her in the lamplight of the study. And outside, the spring night settled over Painted Rock with the generosity that good seasons have. And the house was full of the particular warmth of a place that has been worked for and fought for and cared for, the warmth that only belonging produces. In the years that followed, they added a third child, a boy they named Thomas in 1892, who was from birth possessed of a sunny equanimity that seemed to balance his sister's intensity and his brother's focus in the way that families sometimes find their balance by producing what they need. James, growing into his teens, developed a formidable talent with horses that went beyond management into something closer to communication, the same quality his father had with cattle, an instinctive understanding that came from paying attention at the deepest level. Ada watched this with pleasure and recognized in it something she understood, the particular satisfaction of someone who has found the thing their nature was organized around. Charlotte, at age 7, was already reading the books in her mother's study, with a focused intensity that Ada monitored without attempting to redirect, because she recognized what she was looking at and had no intention of making the mistake of damping it down. Charlotte's questions were the questions of someone who was accumulating information for a purpose, and Ada answered all of them with the directness she had always wished had been applied to her own questions when she was 7. Pete Haskell retired in 1891 with a handshake and a genuine affection on both sides, going to live with his daughter in Topeka. Ada gave him 6 months' wages as a parting settlement, which he protested and accepted, and which he told his daughter was the most honest thing any employer had done for him in 40 years of ranch work. Billy Cartwright married a schoolteacher from Caldwell in 1892 and settled half a mile from Painted Rock, which meant he was still available to play the fiddle at occasions that required it, and was near enough that his children and the Langston children formed a unit of neighborhood society that kept the surrounding roads in a constant state of animation. Marshall Beaumont died in 1893, and Ada attended the funeral in Caldwell along with a substantial portion of the county, because Cord Beaumont had been one of those men who anchor a community and whose loss is felt as a structural change. She wrote a letter to his widow that she took considerable care with, because she wanted it to say true things rather than comfortable ones. And in that letter she thanked Margaret Beaumont for having had a husband who had believed that the law was for everyone. The winter of 1894 brought an ice storm that was the most severe the region had seen in a decade, and that required every person on the ranch working at full capacity for 3 consecutive days to keep the cattle out of the worst of it. Ada was out in it herself on the second day, when the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and they had a section of herd drifting the wrong direction toward a creek that had partially frozen and was dangerous. She and Wesley and Marcus spent 4 hours in conditions that were genuinely dangerous moving that herd back to the sheltered pasture, and when it was done and they were back in the barn stripping off frozen outer layers and the horses were blanketed, Wesley looked at Ada with ice still in his hair and said, "You are the most relentless person I have ever known." The cattle needed moving, she said, which was her father's practicality speaking, and he smiled and pulled her against him and held her in the cold barn, and she could feel the warmth of him even through the layers of wool and leather. "I know," he said. "I just want you to know that I know it." "I know you know it," she said. "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other." "We have always understood each other," she said. "That's rather the point." The documents of the Harmon forgery case sat in Ada's legal files throughout these years, carefully preserved, alongside the authentication evidence she had assembled and her handwriting analysis notes. She had considered, more than once, writing up the method she had used for publication, because there was no organized literature on frontier document authentication from a practical standpoint, and she had developed something genuinely useful that was not available anywhere in codified form. She began writing it in 1894, on winter evenings by the fire when the children were in bed, and the accounts were balanced and the lamplight was good. It was a practical manual on document authentication with specific application to land deeds and commercial contracts in frontier territories, and she wrote it the way she did everything, thoroughly and without unnecessary decoration. She sent it first to a legal journal in Kansas City, and it was returned with a polite note suggesting she might try a different audience. She sent it next to a legal publishing house in Chicago with a letter that was considerably more direct about its contents and utility. And in 1896, it was published in a modest edition that sold primarily to law offices and county recorders' offices, and to at least one territorial court that Ada received a letter from thanking her for the clarity of the work. Wesley read the published copy from cover to cover with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered, and when he was done, he set it on the kitchen table and looked at her for a long moment. "It's good," he said. "I know," she said, because she had made it so. "Your father's injury is in Chapter 2, he said. "As an illustrative example," she said, "it's the clearest case I know of for the principal. It's also the thing that saved the ranch," he said. "I know that too," she said. He nodded slowly. "He'd have been proud of that, the book. He'd have said it was practical," she said. "Which is his highest compliment," Wesley smiled. "Then I say the same thing." The spring of 1897 brought a development on the eastern boundary of Painted Rock that turned out to be the last serious property dispute the ranch would face. A development company from Wichita, acting on behalf of a railroad expansion interest, attempted to claim an easement through the eastern 40 acres, the same 40 acres that Gerald Harmon had attempted to steal 14 years earlier, using a right-of-way filing that had been, Ada determined after 2 hours of examination, prepared with significant misrepresentation of the original land survey boundaries. She and Wesley rode to Wichita together to contest it in person, Ada with her documentation in a leather case, and Wesley beside her with the quiet steadiness of someone who knows that the person next to them is going to handle this and is there to support rather than to lead. She presented her case to the development company's legal representative, a young man from the East who had not encountered anything like Ada Talbot before, and who found the experience evidently disorienting. She laid out the survey discrepancies with reference to 3 historical documents and 2 physical landmarks, identified the specific point in the right-of-way filing where the boundary description deviated from the established record, and noted with careful precision that the deviation, if not corrected, would constitute the same category of fraudulent land claim that had previously resulted in criminal prosecution in Caldwell County, and she named the case and the year. The development company's representative looked at her across the table for a moment, and then looked at the documents, and then looked at the man beside her who had said nothing, but who occupied space in the room with the solid certainty of someone who was prepared for whatever came next. The easement claim was withdrawn within a week. On the drive home from Wichita in the bright spring afternoon, with the Kansas prairie opening out on both sides of the road and the world green and wide, Wesley said, "You named the Harmon case." "I did," she said. "Intentional." "Entirely," she said. Men who work for development companies in 1897 know what criminal prosecution for land fraud costs their clients. It was the most efficient point to make. He looked at her sideways with that expression. 14 years and you're still the most dangerous person in any room you walk into. Only when someone is trying to take what isn't theirs, she said. "Well," he said, "no one ever seems to learn." "They will," she said, "eventually." He took her hand on the seat of the wagon, and they drove home through the spring afternoon, and Painted Rock was visible from a mile away, The house and the barn and the cedar grove dark against the grass. The same 3,700 acres plus 300 more that her father had built and she had kept, and they had made into something neither of them alone could have made. James was 11 that spring. Charlotte was 8 and had recently announced that she intended to study law, a declaration that Ada received with a satisfaction she was careful not to make too visible because Charlotte was the kind of child who needed to feel that her ambitions were her own and not someone else's plan for her, which Ada understood from personal experience. Thomas was 5 and was possessed of his father's equanimity and his mother's precision in equal measure, and had recently developed a serious interest in the mechanics of the water pump in the east barn, which Ada noted with the private amusement of someone who sees a pattern repeating in a new key. The life of Painted Rock in those years was full in the way of things that are built with intention and maintained with care. There were difficult seasons and good ones. There were years when the cattle market was difficult and years when it was generous. There were moments of friction and moments of perfect accord, and the long middle ground of ordinary days that contain most of what life actually is. Ada kept records of all of it. The ledgers extended across the study shelves in a line that now went back to her father's earliest entries, and occasionally she spent evenings reading backward through them, through the years of her own management and into her father's hand, the careful left-hand script that she could identify in a courtroom with 22 years of samples, and she felt the continuity of it as something physical, as something that connected her to the land and to him, and to the chain of careful attention that had kept this place alive. Wesley in those years had become so fully part of Painted Rock that it was impossible to imagine the place without him, which was a thing Ada had not been able to say about any other person after her father died. He had grown into the place the way trees grow into landscapes, with a slow certainty that made him seem to have always been there, and he was known in the county as one of the honest men, the men who said what they meant and did what they said and whose word was the same as a contract. He had also, Ada observed, become quietly formidable in the area of document and contract review, having absorbed more of her methods than she had quite tracked. In 1895, he had identified a pricing error in a feed contract that saved the ranch $400, not because the error was particularly subtle, but because he had learned to read supply contracts the way she had taught him, with attention to the places where imprecision was cultivated rather than accidental. She told him he had learned well. He said she was a good teacher. She said she was a thorough one, which was different, and he smiled at the echo of their old exchange. The summer of 1899 was the last summer of the century, and they felt the weight of that in the way that people at the end of long eras feel things, not quite knowing what they are feeling except that it has something to do with time and what it carries. Ada turned 42 that year. She was still the sharpest person in most rooms. Her hair had begun to show its first silver, which she wore with the same practicality she applied to everything that was simply true. She rode the fence line 3 days a week. She had 2 legal manuals now, the second one published in 1898, both in use by court systems across 3 territories. Wesley was 48 and still moved through the world with the solid purposefulness that had characterized him since October of 1883 when he had fixed a stranger's fence because it needed doing. He had gray at his temples now and a new line or two at the corners of his eyes, and was, in Ada's assessment, which was carefully maintained and frequently revised, more handsome at 48 than he had been at 31. Because age had given his face the same quality it gave to landscapes and good wood, a depth that was only produced by time. James was 13 and already understood the cattle operation with a depth that suggested he would exceed his father's management capacity within the decade. Charlotte was 10 and had obtained from Ada's study, with permission, the relevant volume of Kansas legal statutes, and was reading them with the concentrated intensity that Ada recognized as the beginning of a genuine vocation. Thomas was 8 and had successfully repaired the east barn pump mechanism himself with minimal assistance, a fact that both Ada and Wesley treated with a gravity appropriate to the occasion. On the last evening of 1899, with the 20th century one day away, they sat on the porch of Painted Rock in the winter cold with the stars very bright and clear above the prairie, Ada and Wesley, with the children in bed inside, and the house warm behind them and the cedar grove dark at the northeast corner, and the land going away in all directions in the particular way of land that belongs to you, which is to say that it does not belong to you so much as you belong to it. "What do you think the next century looks like?" Wesley said. Ada considered. "Complicated," she said. "Faster, more people wanting more things, more paper, more documents to question." She paused. "Charlotte is going to do something remarkable in law." "She is," he agreed. "James is going to run this ranch better than either of us. Thomas is going to understand how things work in a way that neither of us quite does," Ada said. "Then we've done well," Wesley said. "We've done the work," Ada said, which was her version of the same thing. He put his arm around her on the porch in the cold, and she settled into his side in the way she had settled there for 16 years, with the ease of something that has found its right place and remained there. "Ada," he said. "What?" "That morning in October, 1883, when the man came with the forged document." She looked up at him. "What about it?" "I've thought about it," he said, "over the years, about what would have happened if he'd arrived on a day I wasn't there, if you'd handled it alone." "I would have handled it the same way," she said. "I didn't need you there for the handling." "I know," he said. "That's not what I mean." He looked out at the dark ranch. "I mean that watching you do that morning was when I knew that I was done, that there was no going anywhere else. I was watching someone I was going to love for the rest of my life, and I didn't know it yet." She was quiet for a moment. "You were very good at not showing it," she said. "I was terrified of it," he said, which was an admission, and she knew it. "Why?" "Because I had never met anyone like you before," he said, "and I didn't know what someone like me did with someone like you." She looked at him directly. "You let me be exactly what I am," she said, "and you were exactly what you are. That's all it was." "That's all it was," he repeated, and there was warmth in it and something deeper, the reflection of everything that had come from that morning in October, the years and the children and the work, and the life built on the same foundation that had been laid before they even knew they were laying it. The ranch was quiet around them. The prairie was dark and wide. The stars were the same stars that had been there before either of them, and would be there after, and in the meantime there was the porch and the cold and the warmth between them and the century turning over like a page. "Come inside," Ada said. "In a minute," he said. She stayed. They both stayed a minute longer, looking out at Painted Rock in the last night of the old century, the land her father had built and she had kept, and they had made into something that would last beyond them into whatever came next. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the thing that practical people know is the best kind of love, the kind that grows in the dark and in the difficulty, the kind that is built from honest work and mutual respect, and the willingness to stand still when someone you love needs you to stand still, and to move when they need you to move. Ada Talbot had exposed a forger in her kitchen with 22 years of careful attention, and a dead man's broken fingers, and the pure relentless force of knowing what was hers and refusing to let it be taken. And from that morning, from that refusal, from the witness of one Wesley Langston who had watched her and been changed by what he saw, everything else had grown. Painted Rock stood at the start of the new century the way good things stand, not because nothing had threatened it, but because the person responsible for it had never, not once, let the threat be larger than the truth. And that, in the end, was the whole of the story.